We are approaching one of the last things today on our program. It's roundtable and discussion on the poetry of Paul Celan. I will start by giving word to Bertrand Badiou, who will explain this document that you can see here. Then I will ask several questions to all participants of the roundtable, and I ask them to speak only maybe up to 5 minutes about some general questions about Celan's poetry, and then we will hopefully leave some time for general discussion where you can, ask questions. So without further ado, Mr. Badiou, if you would like to explain this.
Il se trouve que dans mes archives que j'ai apportées, j'ai découvert que j'avais emmené l'unique témoignage qu'on connaisse de Celan au sens juridique du terme. On a parlé des poèmes. Là, il s'agit d'une déclaration juridique qu'il a faite, et c'est pas n'importe quelle déclaration.
You see before you the very important document, a unique document that I happen to have with me, and I wanted to present it for you.
On voit qu'il est signé Paul Anschel, qui est le véritable nom de Paul Celan.
It's a document signed by Paul Celan, but signed as Paul Anschel.
Oui, on va descendre. Pour un homme qui s'appelle Maximilian Goldhagen.
This is for a man named Maximilian Goldhagen,
qui a été dans les camps de travail avec lui.
Who was in the camp with Paul at the time.
Voilà. Et le document donc est un document à usage juridique.
And it's a legal document.
Pour obtenir de l'Allemagne ce qu'on appelle une compensation. Dans le cas.
Seeking compensation from Germany. And it's a unique document. It's the only legal document signed by Paul Anschel.
Voilà. Il décrit la vie dans les camps de travail, ce qu'il n'a fait à aucun moment dans sa vie.
And he describes in it life in the camps, which he didn't otherwise do ever in his life.
Et pour finir, je dirais, il est signé donc à Paris le 10 octobre 64.
As you can see, it's signed in Paris in October 1964.
Et je propose que si il y a des actes de ces journées qui sont publiés, eh bien je le donnerai volontiers à ces actes pour dans le cadre des interventions sur Paul Celan.
If anyone's publishing anything on the topic, I'd be happy to share this to be published along with any documents on the topic.
Thank you. Now my first and very broad question, so you are free to pick up on anything that you like, concerns some, as I said, general issues regarding Celan's poetry. It would be about the relevance of Holocaust in his poetry. And more precisely, I would like to ask the following. As is very famously known, in 1949, Adorno said to write poetry after Auschwitz is barbaric, which is commonly understood as poetry is impossible after Auschwitz. Now, Celan experienced the Holocaust, and it affected him profoundly. And yet, unlike Adorno, not only that he continued to write poetry, but he actually tried to express this experience within poetic language itself. And not only that, but moreover, in a language that he once described, the language of his mother and his mother's murderers, so in German. So why is that? And I would like just to read 2 sentences from 1958, his speech on the occasion of receiving the Literature Prize of the Free Hanseatic City of Bremen. So what Celan said in 1958. Only one thing remained reachable, close and secure amid all losses. Language. Yes, language. In spite of everything, it remained secure against loss. But it had to go through its own lack of answers, through terrifying silence, through the 1,000 darknesses of murderous speech. It went through. It gave me no words for what was happening, but went through it. Went through and could resurface, enriched by it all. So, to sum up, how did Holocaust influence Celan's poetry? How are we to understand this, in a way, anti-Adornian trust in language? And how can language speak the unspeakable? So that would be one general question. Whatever you would like to pick from here, please. Yes, please.
Thank you for those comments. I've written a couple of notes down that sort of start with Salan, what you've just said, but then become more general. I think all of us thought it would be really helpful to try and think about the other kinds of poetry we've heard about, the Yugoslavian wars, and try and bring them together with Salan. And as we know, Adorno reversed, or at least critiqued his own statement about no poetry after Auschwitz, and I think it's even been quoted that he said, the person who's tortured has every right to scream. And we've seen that poetry has continued to be a really powerful form of witness and or testimony. So I've just got a few points that I wanted to mention. One was that I was really struck by what Professor Badiou mentioned about the newspaper intertext that Salan used, the kind of the factual material that actually appears in what often seem to be very abstract poems. And I think we've seen exactly the same in the poems about the Yugoslavian conflict. The second thing was what's very clearly a very bad mental illness, and obviously it's hard to say whether that pre-existed the trauma that he underwent, and I think that's been another factor that we've heard a lot about people who are very traumatized and express that in their writing, or are interviewed and express it in that way and pass it on to other generations. And obviously that was definitely the case with Salan. The third thing, that we've been asking a lot about whether poetry is an improving kind of moral benefit. And it seems the thing that's really stayed in my mind is that film of Karadzic, the poet, from yesterday, and clearly in his case, it was anything but. It was used as an excuse. So though we might say testimony can be poetry, I'm not sure that we can say that poetry is a moral force. Even though, by contradiction, language itself is obviously very powerful, and people's minds and behaviour are very affected by that, particularly national language, which again goes back to Salan, who chose the national language he wrote in, as did many of the poets we've heard about since then. And I think those are my points, except to say that I've learnt the most enormous amount, and I'd really like to say thank you to Noah, wherever she is at the moment, for everything that she's done in putting this event together to allow us to think about the Yugoslavian writing alongside, I say Yugoslavian, meaningfully, alongside Salan's poetry.
Thank you.
I would like to pick up. Is this on? Yeah. As Sue just mentioned, Adorno did take back that statement, cautiously so. It might have been wrong to claim, and then the famous statement of the late 40s. But I've always read this statement literally. So there is a kind of a political, human way of reading it. How can people write poetry when they should be doing something else, presumably, in the face of atrocity, etc.? But if you read the word barbarisch literally in the Greek sense, then it could be read as suggesting that if you do write poetry in light of what happened, then the language you will be using will not be the language spoken by the majority. It will sound like ba 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 ba, which is what the Greeks called barbaroi, those who did not speak Attic Greek. Now, in that sense, Celan could be the exemplar of the kind of poetry that should have been and was, in fact, written after Auschwitz. Now, that's my reading of the statement in context, without having to constantly have recourse to its 4 iterations in Adorno's own oeuvre, up to the very last one in which he fully retracts it. And then so if approached in this light, I couldn't help thinking of what Robert von Hallberg mentioned earlier today, that poetry makes nothing happen. Auden's famous line from his elegy on the death of William Butler Yeats. But later in the poem, he says something else as well about what poetry does. And I just brought these lines, and I think if you allow me to read them very briefly and then make the point I think I want to make. So at some point he says in that stanza, for poetry makes nothing happen, it survives in the valley of its making, where executives would never want to tamper, flows on south from ranches of isolation and the busy griefs, raw towns that we believe and die in. It survives a way of happening, a mouth. And so, whether poetry makes anything happen or not will always be a moot point. We know that Karachic's poetry literally did make certain things happen, very negative things. We know that he tried to make it do things happen in court. We know that the prosecutor tried to use poetry to make things happen in the legal sense. But if we apply it to Celan's testimonial role vis-à-vis the Holocaust, then one could say, in his own barbaric way, that he set the path. He gave a kind of a mold, a matrix, as to how one could poetically talk about it without falling into the trap of using a language that had been abused, for instance. So he did present a way of happening, even though he might not have made anything happen directly. And in that sense, he could be indeed said to be, as far as the German language is concerned, one of the prime poets to testify to what had happened to him, to others, because there was a way both in which he said it, the way between him and the place where it happened. He was an outsider. So it's all about his own notion of unterwegs sein, that literally gets embodied in the way he spoke. And the way, I'm using it now in a punning kind of way, is intentional, obviously.
Thank you.
Could I just pick up on what Michael was saying there about the relationship really between Celan and Adorno? And I'm not a huge Celan expert, so I'll stand corrected by Bertrand and others if this is incorrect. But I think for those of you who maybe aren't totally familiar with Celan and his work, and Adorno as well, my understanding of this kind of dialogue in a way that takes place between the two is that when Adorno is first making these kind of pronouncements about the idea that it is barbaric to write lyric poetry after Auschwitz, and this is related to Celan, that's related to Celan's early work, and specifically Todesfuge, which you mentioned towards the end of the chapter there, which is a very famous poem by Celan, and it's clearly his most musical. It's clearly one of his most kind of direct poems in terms of its dealing with the Holocaust and those kind of and Holocaust imagery in a very direct way, and it's really the poem that made him famous. But it employs a kind of lyricism that Celan himself would sort of famously reject as his career goes on. He moves towards this more kind of hermetic or sealed, closed, symbolic poetry that many people feel is more and more sort of impenetrable, less and less referential, less obviously about the Holocaust in a direct way. And I kind of agree with Michael then that what's interesting to me is that as Adorno then goes on and sort of qualifies his statements and says, you know, suffering has every right to expression and all these things in later essays like Commitment, where he basically, what he's saying is that the condition of poetry after Auschwitz is a condition of paradox. You know, you can't write poetry after Auschwitz and yet you have to. Well, Celan moves towards a very, very similar position in his poetry and his poetics, as you were saying. I think he sort of exemplifies a lot of the points that Adorno was making when you read out the passages from Meridian there, where you're talking about the idea that Celan has that as language passes through the thousand darknesses of death-bringing speech, it's the perpetrator's language, but he as a poet simultaneously finds it enriched. That's a very kind of Adornian kind of statement, you know, that is finding this surplus in meaning in negation. So I think it's a kind of complex relationship, but we have to think about it as a sort of transition in Adorno's thought that is also mirrored by a transition in Celan's poetry as he develops.
And maybe just to add one thing, enriched for those who don't have German, He uses the word angereichert in the speech, which contains the word Reich. So it wasn't only a surplus, but it was saturated with the history of the Third Reich as well, obviously.
So, thank you. My thoughts to your question about how did the Holocaust influence Celan's poetry. In my studies of Celan, I was very influenced by an American Celan scholar, John Felstiner, who wrote a book that I really like a lot that's titled How Celan, Poet, Survivor, Jew, in that order, that he's a poet, he's a survivor, and also a Jew. And I think that's very enlightening about how I approach Celan's poetry, that he is first and foremost a poet. As Bertrand said, this document is one of the few, if any, where he explicitly addresses his experiences in the work or concentration camp as he preferred to find expression through poetry. He was a survivor, so that tells us that there was this need for testimony and for bearing witness of his experiences as the third part, as a Jew, which is very important for his identity. And I noticed that at the first line, I believe, he states, Ich bin Jude, and clearly says that he identifies as a Jew. Also, from the Bremen speech, as you mentioned, as Matthew also said, I think that it's important when thinking about his poetry that he does, and this reflects again on a lot of the things that we've heard today and yesterday, move from a state of loss through a state of silence. We heard excellent panels this morning about silence and the labor of forgetting, silencing, and the labor of remembering. And then moves through articulation through poetry, in which he indirectly addresses these experiences that he had in the Holocaust as a Jew, as a survivor. And I guess what I would like to close with is actually to ask a question for all of us here, and sort of turning the question that I believe it was Scheherazade asked this morning about if we can become better people by reading anti-war poetry. I'd like to ask the question, can we become better people by reading poetry of testimony? Is this something that enables us as readers to have a moral or ethical experience? Is it a catharsis for the poet, but also an agent of change for the reader, perhaps? And then finally, to try to tie together the first day that we had of Celan with the fantastic panels that I've heard and been very educated by, is there anything that we have to learn from Celan and the Holocaust, the testimony and memorialization of the Second World War, that can be useful or applied to the situation in the Balkans? And I don't have an answer for that, but I would be very interested in hearing what others who are experts on this work about testimony and memorialization of the war in the Balkans, are there parallels, are there things that can be learned from the poetry of the Holocaust that can be applied or useful to the situation in the Balkans? Thank you.
Please.
I feel this question, is this working? Yeah. I feel this question rather intimidating. It's such a difficult question. But what comes to my mind at the moment is that we might well say that poetry died in Auschwitz, and it's not. We cannot take it for granted that that it survived, that language survived this atrocity. And I think this is more or less what's at stake in this dialectic between Adorno's statement and Celan's poetry, because what Adorno says that it's barbaric to write poems after Auschwitz. I think Celan in a way agrees, because you cannot. Let's say that there have been certain preconceptions of what poetry is and what it should be, and this is not to be taken for granted. It should have never taken be for granted, perhaps, and he's very opposed to well, for instance, the concept of metaphor. He was he objected to to the use of the concept of metaphor in interpreting his poetry and poetry in general. And his poetry is anything but taking poetry for granted, or taking language and testimony for granted. I don't know what else to say.
Okay.
I think I should say at the beginning that I regard Adorno's statement as a red herring. I don't think it's a useful thing. I'm not going to say anything about it. I have been struck, I think I said this a couple of days ago, I'm struck by the lack of fit between testimony and Celan's poetic project. And am I not getting through? I'm on the edge of my seat now. I'll try to get closer. And so the phrase "das zu viel meiner Rede" seems to me really important in Celan because it indicates that his manner of writing is extremely austere, and the subject of the Holocaust has generated volumes, just enormous appetite for talk about and representation of the Holocaust. He does not have that. He does not succumb to the appetite for representation. He is resisting representation of the Holocaust, as I understand the poetry. And it's for an artist, the subject of the Holocaust is extremely hot, and it's elephantine. It's huge. And to engage it means that the great danger is that your art will be extremely obvious, or that you will be stamped into the ground by it because it's too big for your craft. And I think he understood that, and I think he pulled back from the elephant constantly. And we, in talking about Celan's poetry, I think we need to correct ourselves when we use the same terms for talking about Celan's poetry that we would use to discuss an essay. He wrote very few essays, and that really was not that fullness of explanation or of narrative, that was not his gift. The art of poetry is an art of memory, of making something memorable. And in that way, testament that's a real nexus with the notion of giving testimony. But of what does he give testimony? And I think he gives testimony of something eccentric, something peculiar about his experience and his way of relating to his own life, his own relationship to his own grief, his parents, the not done, and his resistance to fullness of expression. He's not a fluent writer. He's a very austere writer. And so I think, for myself, I would like to be able to discuss his poetry at some distance from the subject of the Holocaust, because I think what I feel in the poetry is a constant pushing back against that subject. And that tells us something about poetic making and about the close proximity to atrocity which he experienced. He lived close to an atrocity, and his reaction was not to tell all about it. That really wasn't that wasn't where he saw his art. So I'll stop there.
Professor Askin, you would like to reply?
I think, it's what you said, Bob, is very thought-provoking, and I wonder whether there might be, let's call it a spurious opposition between, well, an opposition that does not apply to Celan, and I think might not even apply to the 4 days that we will have witnessed tomorrow. Namely, that there is an imputation of the goal of representing the Holocaust. The Holocaust being represented is a totally different thing, and I don't think the testimony needs to be understood in representational terms to begin with. And I think this is the kind of the arc that you built toward the end of your intervention. And so I completely agree. If we want representations of the Holocaust, Celan is not the right person to go to. But testimony, potentially yes. And there, there you made me think of something that might be the core of the issue. Like anything we experience as human beings, there's only the aggregate kind of collection of a myriad of experiences by each and every one that then gets abstracted into something that is out there historically. But the Holocaust only existed in the millions and millions of people who underwent it, right? So in that sense, you can only testify to it individually and eccentrically by and through what you went through experiencing this non-existent it, if you will. Does this make sense?
Yes.
And so maybe you were actually then shoring up against your own maybe argument, or what I took to be your argument, his actual testimonial force.
I think my sense is yes, but what makes the art interesting is the surprising way, in the eccentric way, in which this person who is very close to the fire, how he speaks of it, lives with it, and how he lives with language after that. That is really compelling. And one thing I didn't say is the other side. And I said that it's an elephantine subject, and that the hazard to an artist is that he or she be crushed by it. It's the weight of extreme judgments and extreme feelings, and how he clears space for himself from that. That is, the eccentricity and peculiarity. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Can I just make one comment there briefly? Sorry, is this on? Hello? Can I just make a brief comment there in response to this idea that this is kind of eccentric from side? Because I see where you're coming from, but one of the most kind of commonplace critical observations that's been made about the kind of testimony that you seem to be evoking, which is more realistic. It's giving us a more sort of straightforward depiction of events and people's direct personal experiences in camps, is that in this writing what we find is that these survivors come up against the limits of representation, that these experiences are so extreme that they resist the possibility of any kind of form of straightforward linguistic expression. And in the sort of the great prose accounts of literary testimony, people like Charlotte Delbo, Primo Levi, Elie Wiesel, their testimonies will constantly suggest that they are encountering limits to what they're able to say. So Saul Friedlander, when he writes or edits his landmark collection in 1992, it's probing the limits of representation, and this is what he's suggesting these writers are doing in a more sort of realistic testimonial mode. And so given that, what's interesting to me is that those ones that I've mentioned, you know, Charlotte Delbo, Primo Levi, they're very, very successful testimonies. But if we're to take seriously this proposition, and we should, that the Holocaust presented experiences that just surpass any straightforward linguistic representation, then what you're also going to encounter that I've always been interested in are literary failures. Writers who've tried to write and fail. I've been always interested in John Berryman, a fantastic American poet, tried to write a cycle of poems about the Holocaust, and he failed. But you're also then going to encounter writers like Celan, who aren't able to work in that kind of, you use the expression that he doesn't, sorry, you said that he's not able to write with the fullness of expression of some of the writers. But I think encountering that kind of exact opposite does tell us something really, really important about that experience that he went through and his experience as a writer. And so Michael, when he gave his talk on, I think, the first day, sort of interestingly paired off Etty Hilsum, somebody who writes in that more kind of straightforward, realistic testimonial mode, and Celan. And his conclusion was that we need both. And I kind of totally agree with that. It's that we understand Celan by having writers like Levy, like Hilson, like whoever you want to name, but somebody who writes in a more straightforward, accessible testimonial mode. But having a Celan there as well still tells us something very, very important about that experience. It testifies to something, how he experienced it through language, how he feels as a writer in language afterwards. So to me, he is still testifying to something there.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm vastly outnumbered, but I will not go down without putting a fight. So let's give the chance to Mr. Badiou to say. I will complicate it a little bit further because they deviated from the original question, and they. Sorry. Okay.
Je voudrais juste dire que il me semble qu'Adorno prend une perspective très allemande et oublie son propre lien au judaïsme en posant cette question.
I just want to say that Adorno he has a very German approach to the question, and he forgets his own Jewish aspect to this issue.
Pour qui est-il impossible d'écrire des poèmes?
For whom is it impossible to write?
Pour les poètes allemands? Oui.
For German poets, yes.
Parce que la situation de la poésie allemande après 1945 laisse un peu perplexe.
Because the situation for German poetry after 1945 is a little complicated.
Les meilleurs poètes sont des héritiers de Brecht, c'est-à-dire qu'ils ancrent leurs racines dans un temps qui précède la guerre.
The best poets work in the legacy of Brecht and work with roots that belonged before the war.
Deuxième petite remarque.
Second remark.
Adorno est revenu sur sa parole.
And Adorno took back the famous phrase.
Il est revenu sur sa parole parce qu'il était très gêné de l'avoir écrite après avoir rencontré Celan.
He was very uncomfortable to have written it before, so he took it back.
Et il a donc vu que ce qu'il aurait dû penser,
he understood that what he should have said or thought,
c'était la possibilité d'une rupture très très violente à l'intérieur de la poésie.
And then what he should have said is that the possibility of a break within poetry.
Et cette rupture, Celan l'a appelée Atemwende.
And that rupture is called Atemwende. J'ai mal prononcé ça. Très bien.
Merci.
Okay, thank you. I apologize to the audience. It seems I created a monster. By mentioning Adorno, I simply wanted to juxtapose, to emphasize this, language and poetry and expressiveness of this unspeakable. Not to bring Adorno too much into front. I give up on having a lot of more questions. I will ask one more that somehow comes from your discussion. So maybe if you can make remarks, let's say, vaguely concluding remarks regarding your points, so we have some time for the audience. You brought up this question of testimony, and that's the question of the overall conference. So maybe it's too broad, maybe it's too naive, but I wanted to ask, we see that there is only one, let's say, document that Celan produced regarding his experience. So why testimony and poetry? What is it? Why not testify, in front of the grand jury? Why not testify in legal terms? Why not testify in documentary way? What is the Celan's and general specificity of testifying through poetic language rather than through other forms. So you can completely disregard my question, but I would just like to hear your general points, and maybe we can do this in this time in reversed order. So maybe Mr. Badiou first, and then others.
Question très difficile pour moi de répondre spontanément, mais
Difficult for me to answer quickly.
si j'ai bien compris, je pense que Celan considère toute sa poésie et prononce toute sa poésie devant un tribunal invisible.
But if I understood the question correctly, Celan says and writes all his poetry before an invisible tribunal.
Et ce tribunal invisible, dans ce tribunal invisible sont cités à témoin.
In this invisible tribunal, there's invisible witnesses.
Tous les témoins qui ne peuvent pas être là.
All the witnesses who couldn't speak.
Voilà. Et qu'il imagine telles les étoiles qui constellent le ciel.
And that he considers as many as there are stars in the sky.
C'est-à-dire l'étoile que les Juifs portaient sur leur poitrine.
Stars that Jews carried on their chests.
Et qui a brûlé avec leurs cendres,
that
avec leur
burned
corps.
with their bodies.
Professor van Halberg, please.
Don't know. I'm absorbing this phrase of the invisible. I'm absorbing the phrase of the invisible tribunal, and I find that pretty striking. So I'm going to pass.
Thank you. Please.
Well, as a follow-up to my first so-called answer, the last thing I said was that I don't know what else to say, and immediately I felt that I should retract some things I said. There's something that right away became bothering me in what I myself said about when I used the word Auschwitz. It's so in a way it's so easy. I just said that Paul Celan was very much against the use of the concept of metaphor in dealing with poetry, and I was myself using this metonymy Auschwitz. But we must remember that the event called Auschwitz, it was unique and singular, but it was at the same time millions of events that were unique and singular. It was composed of millions of events that were millions of ends of the world, as Jacques Derrida might say. And as we have learned here, the atrocities never stopped. And the thing about Paul Celan's sort of this personal trouble about the Gol affair, about his suspicion against almost everyone and so on, and him saying that there are so few mensch around. He was afraid that it all comes back, that it all will be repeated. And I think his poems are imbued with this resistance, this fear of the imminence, of the imminent return of the atrocities, and also perhaps there are sort of roadblocks against the use of language, such a use of language that could be propaganda, performative speech acts in the sense of making something happen again.
You think
Maybe
that there are such roadblocks in place?
Sorry.
Am I understanding you to be saying that you think that we have more roadblocks in place against the misuse of language? No, I'm not arguing.
I'm just thinking of the phrase "no pasaran." It's found also in Poussin's
Right.
poems.
So your question, I think, was why testify through poetry? My answer would be very banal, that Celan was a poet. As I mentioned in Felstener's book, is entitled Paul Celan, Poet, Survivor, Jew. So first and foremost, he was a poet. And I think that it's a very valid form of expression. Artists, painters would express their feelings, their artistic expression through arts, musicians, novelists, etc. So for him, as a poet, this is what he was, his identity as a writer. But I don't think that's the answer you were looking for necessarily for the question. And I would also say, I guess, that poetry can express things that prose cannot. That prose or documentation can provide information, but poetry for Celan was an attempt at trying to create a dialogue and to try to testify something and express things that prose can't, or that other forms of art can't. And that comes back, I think, to the question that Noah asked on the first day, is what exactly is being testified, or what exactly is the essence of it? Is it about a system or the machinery of the Holocaust, or is it about the personal experience? And I would argue that his poetry is very much about testifying to the dehumanizing effect of genocide, of totalitarianism, in a way that prose cannot. It uses a elevated language, a stylized language, an ethical language that speaks to the human soul as opposed to the banality of information.
Thank you. I see some questions in the audience. Just please give us a few more minutes so we can have a second round of contributions from our distinguished speakers, and I will pass on to you.
I just have a very quick point, because it very much echoes what David's saying. Like, in response to your question about whether we can understand this poetry as a poetry of testimony, the immediate question I ask is, what are you testifying to? And I completely agree with Robert. If what we're looking for is an account of what actually happened to people in the camps, or even what their kind of feelings and emotions were at the time, then clearly this is not very good as testimony. It doesn't stand up to any kind of scrutiny on that kind of framework. But as David said, this is Paul Celan, the poet, who experiences the Holocaust as a poet. He's somebody who's intimately aware of the relationship between language and being. I think Bertrand referred to his work as poems of existence, okay? And so this is how he experiences the event of the Holocaust. And so if we want to think of his poems as testifying to how this relationship between his being and language has been fractured or broken, changed, restored after the Holocaust, then yes, he's testifying to that kind of thing, but not to sort of the straightforward, or to the sort of, you described them, I think, as the banal kind of facts. I don't think they're banal, I think they're, but the kind of...
But not in an elevated style.
Yeah, exactly. Just people's experience of the camps, then no, but there is something fundamental that I do think as a poet he is testifying to that says a lot about his experience.
Thank you.
I will respond in two ways very briefly. I'll try to be very brief as well. One is biographical. And I think what we shouldn't forget, Celan was the first. He was really early in German terms. When the Gruppe 47 emerged as the arbiter of German poetic taste, the one thing they wanted is a literature that will not talk about all of these atrocities directly, but in an basically don't touch it at all, and if you do, aestheticize. I'm simplifying, but so Celan arguably was the first non-compromised poet in the German language to literally address what had happened only 2 years previously. So in that sense, he is an exemplary testimony and a witness to what happened, literally speaking. And to this day, I would venture to say, now I haven't visited German high schools in a while at this point, but there are still not many poets who are read in German school books, if at all, except for, of his generation, Celan. There are many prose authors, Alfred Anders, Enzensberger, many, many people who wrote essays and prose in all kinds of ways, and poetry, in Enzensberger's case. But he is the go-to poet when poetry is asked to perform as witness within the German context itself. So this kind of historical, chronological priority gives him pride of place as the witness to certain things and in a certain way. But more importantly, from within his own poetry, you mentioned several times that he was against metaphor. If I would just qualify this just slightly, he has this phrase, he calls it Durchkreuzen der Tropen. Not simply doing away with tropes and metaphors, metonymies, but durchkreuzen in the German sense, both as passing through, crossing, something he will do then in the meridian speech, but also redacting, deleting, crossing out. And that might be a poetological answer to your question, why not starting in prose? I don't want to adjudicate on his gifts. He wasn't born a poet, maybe he was, but he definitely became a poet. That we know for sure. But there is an ironclad logic from within his own aesthetics as to why, to reach prose, you have to first cross the tropes. And that's what he's doing. His whole poetic endeavor is one big slog, if you will, through the tropics of metaphor, metonymy, synecdoche, and all of the other tropes that we have, with this goal to reach a certain point, presumably, where you can speak, in a language, in the Benjaminian language of transparency, call it what you will. So that's...
Just following on from what other people have said already, I wanted to say two things. The first is that poetry does seem to be something that people turn to in the heat of the moment of an atrocity happening. And it struck me that some of the Ukrainian eyewitnesses of the very early mass murders by shooting were journalists, including Vasily Grossman, but others as well. And they explicitly said journalism was no use to them. And there's a well-known poem called I Saw It. It's a poem, but not a piece of journalistic writing. As if only poetry could do justice to what that particular Ukrainian journalist had seen. And the second thing is that as everyone was talking earlier, I tried to make a note of the kinds of features of poetry that might actually make it more suitable than prose. And no doubt others will be able to think of some other things. In a way, they're like the written photographs that we heard about earlier. They're like a miniature snapshot of something. Their poetic genres can be very helpful. We've heard about elegy already, lyric, other kinds of genre in a short space, which prose work can't really do. They're allusive. They don't have to absolutely state anything. They can really rely on the reader. They're not necessarily narratives. They're also not necessarily personal, even though they might have a first-person narrator. They don't always. In Todesfuge, which we've heard about, sometimes it's plural and sometimes it's singular. You can mix registers very easily and very quickly in poetry, and maybe that makes it, again, more suitable. It's highly aesthetic, but also can have documentary elements in it. And it seems harder to do that in prose, which must apparently be more appreciable more immediately. So those, and it doesn't have to have truth value. I suppose that's the other thing. It does, and it also doesn't, in a much easier way than for prose. So I suppose those are the things that immediately sprang to my mind that might make poetry more suitable in all the cases that we've heard about over the past few days.
Thank you all immensely for your brevity. We have a fair 30 minutes for discussion, so please, the floor is yours finally. I will ask by the order of appearance, so please. I urge you, if you can ask questions in English, that would simplify things, if possible. If not, then ask in Serbian, we will translate.
I would like to, but I'm not sure what will I say, so I have to speak in Serbo-Croatian, I'm sorry. Primijetila sam da prethodnih dana na konferenciji sve vrijeme u odnos stavljamo poeziju i svjedočenje pred sudom.
Can I translate? Is that we all have headphones?
Yeah, you all have headphones. Okay, let me help you. We have one here. No? Somebody needs help. Sorry for this. Dakle, primijetila sam da prethodnih dana u suodnos poeziju stavljamo zapravo svjedočenje pred sudom, a u oba slučaja se radi o duboko individualnim postupcima. I mislim da je ta paralela nedovoljno poticajna u nekakvom imaginativnom smislu. Ono što duboko individualan čin poeziju po meni osvjetljava na puno bolji način jeste stavljanje u suodnos sa kolektivnim činom, a to je komemorativni čin. Komemorativni čin krije jednu od vjerojatno najperfidnijih rečenica koja upućuje na to koliko ništa ne naučimo iza svakog užasnog događaja zbog kojeg komemoriramo, a govori se u ime kolektiviteta i čak i u najboljoj namjeri, a naravno u najčešćem slučaju je ili nedostatak kreativnosti, imaginacije i znanja, ali uvijek u nekoj najboljoj namjeri, to je rečenica da se zlo više nikada ne ponovi. Ona je meni beskrajno perfidna jer polazi iz etičnog, polazi iz moralnog, a zapravo se time prenebregava činjenica da se zlo ponavlja. Vjerojatno i u momentu održavanja komemoracije i da mi zapravo propuštamo shvatiti da je ono što je profesor iz Finske govorio, ispričavam se, ne znam, nisam zapamtila ime, da je ono imanentno i da je ono u nama, da su to one zvijeri o kojima je Senadin govorio, koje kao lovci tražimo u šumi, a zapravo ih nosimo u sebi. I ako je u nečemu poezija onda zapravo najuspješnija, ona je upravo u tom suočavanju sa tom beskrajno poražavajućom činjenicom da zlo ne prestaje zato što smo svjedočili na sudu protiv zla, nego eventualno zato što smo uspjeli da ga shvatimo u nama samima i da o tome napišemo pjesmu koja će čitatelja dovesti u situaciju da se prepozna u toj pjesmi. Vjerojatno puno lakše nego u nekoj drugoj vrsti formata književnosti. Tako da mislim da ovo svjedočenje pred sudom koje konstantno imamo, koje razumijem jer je posljedica histerije Haškog tribunala, naše balkanske histerije, je zapravo dosta neplodna u smislu da razumijemo zašto bi poezija onda bila izuzetno važna. Ja se ispričavam, ne znam puno o Selanovoj poeziji, ovo je potaknuto vašim, osobito vašim komentarom u smislu Selanove poezije. Hvala.
I see this as a comment, not as a direct question, but if someone would like to reply directly. If not, then, please.
I think that, as I understood what you said about testimony being testimony of the evil within and not just without, this is a subtle understanding of what testimony is. And more commonly, testimony is what the other guy did, and this is something that interests me because I think with the testimony of the sort of that's what the other guy did, it quickly goes to he is a monster, and I'm not a monster. monster, not me, you know, it's the other guy who's a monster. And I find this not charming, you know.
Okay, Georgia?
Thank you. So my question has to do with a problem, perhaps, and I want to share that with you and ask you, how do we think a notion of engagement in relation to testimony? And by engagement, I'm thinking in those traditional terms that Sartre and Adorno thought it, and in the way, how can we move or rethink the notion of engagement in relation to testimony and Celan? What kind of an engagement do we have here? So this is a question for everybody.
This question has come up a lot, I think, not just in respect to the Holocaust poems, but also in respect to some of the writing about Yugoslavia. And it just makes me worry sometimes that we are asking poetry or literature to do something impossible. You know, we're setting some unreasonable expectations. You talked about, well, Adorno, Sartre, when they wrote about commitment. In fact, in Adorno's essay, Commitment, where he talks a lot about Sartre, he also sort of, so he quotes, Sartre, the kind of veneration on the one hand for Picasso's Guernica as this, you know, great work of modernist, expressionist art, something that you might look at as being, as a painting, something comparable to Celan as a poet, working in this sort of modernist abstract mode. But Adorno quotes Sartre saying, at the same time, it never won one single supporter for the Spanish cause. As in, you don't go to an art gallery, look at Picasso's painting of Guernica and think, you know, hallelujah, I'm going to go out and grab a gun and fight for what I now believe is right. Just these works of art don't sort of operate like that. And so when we talk about commitment in the sense which I think that you mean, I just think we need a constellation of responses to these kind of events, as I've said, a constellation of prose accounts, a constellation of poetic accounts, artistic accounts, historical studies, and that kind of political response doesn't necessarily come through some of the more kind of abstract art that we're talking about, but that doesn't mean that that kind of art isn't valuable in its own way.
Please. Yes, well, in case I'm not mistaken, I think Sartre says that literature should engage with freedom and be engaged with all possible. At the same time, it should engage with democracy and all the possible viewpoints. It shouldn't. This is, I think, he says this in Keskellä Literatur. And it was good what you said about this, the possibilities within. So you should perhaps be able to imagine within yourself the possibility of committing atrocities. Well, another thing, I must also return to my first or the second so-called answer. I must again retract something when I mentioned Paul Celan saying that there are very few human beings mentioned. I wouldn't uncritically sign that.
May I comment?
Yeah, yes, please.
I am one who actually does believe, and the way you said it was, you don't go to a gallery and then you decide to fight in the cause of freedom. But if we complicate it a little further, I actually do believe that reading a poem or watching a film, so engaging with a work of art, and by work of art I mean in the most general terms, because we know there are philosophers, Levinas is one, who clearly, and Celan himself, Kunst is one thing, poetry is another thing. Kunst is automata, Kunst is totalizing. Poetry does something different. But I mean art in a very general sense. It can change your life, actually. I do believe that. So I'm a very literal reader. And And this has nothing to do with Rilke, because Rilke did not invent this notion that art can change your life, and that you might, whether you have to or not is a different question. So you can read a poem and understand that war is horrible in a much more concrete way, in my view, than reading about it in a work of documentation or history. So, and I remember myself very, very distinctly when I first heard the poem Have You Forgotten Yet by Siegfried Sassoon, as it was read as a voiceover to in a documentary on the First World War, and read by a very good actor, I forget who it was. It just, you know, nothing has been as powerful as the reading of this poem to bring home to me the just absolute horror of what war must be like. And I only experienced one as a child, but I didn't see any battle. I was in the basement. So I think art does have that power. What I don't believe, though, I would like to believe it, but I don't believe it, realistically speaking, is that you can teach others to read the poems in a way that will make them understand it. And that's the problem of, you know, being a teacher or a professor and trying to convince someone that if you read Todesfuge, you'll become a better, more pacific and peaceable person. So I think the real paradox of art and testimony and what we as humans are capable of, and I do believe we're all potentially capable of all kinds of atrocities. And most of us have done one or the other, in one way or another, to one person or another. So there's this paradox that one would wish that it were possible to transmit this first-hand experience of strong art, making you see something or intuit something or intimate something about who we are. And the factual proof to the contrary, that there are all of these professors and students, and most atrocities had been commissioned throughout history by very educated people who had read all of the poets, including Karadzic and Goebbels and many, many others, and who had not become better people. So I don't think this paradox will ever be resolved, and as trivial as it might be to be talking about this, we still have to continue talking about it.
Okay. I invite other questions as well. Okay. Yeah, I need to give the floor to Noah, then you're next.
I just wanted to say that there's a little bit of this distortion in our view of Celan today, something that Michael and Sue touched about, because we live in a world saturated with testimony, and that the testimony comes very much immediately after the event, whatever positive or negative. But after the Second World War, there were no testimonies. The first mass testimonies that come out after the Second World War is in the Eichmann trial. And they're not even taken as evidence because they cannot fit within the judicial setting. They're not literature. They don't know what to do with them. It's not evidence. It's not literature. It stays in a vacuum. It's very, very late in the period. Only in the 80s, when the Yale archive testimony, and then after Schindler's List and the Holocaust Museum, this is really, really late. And I just wanted to say that also in relation to what Georgie asked, because yes, there was also, there are many social relation conditions that brought it, first of all, there were pressure not to talk about it, and there was in some countries, a general wish for the welfare state, and more talking about the collective than the personal experience, and so on. But I think that the main question was how to deal with the excess. This is something that generally could not be dealt with. And I think that it's these places where society in general cannot deal with the excess that poetry can come in and make its mark. It can indirectly bridge this kind of break, scission that is created, that kind of abyss that suddenly opens with the event. Not even bridge is the right word, but somehow keep it, let's say, keep it in limbo, at least for a while, in order for something, for us to grow up to the event, let's say it like this.
Okay.
Just that's one comment, and the other one, I don't think, I think that from the very first moment of testimonies from Primo Levi, from Celan, there is an internal break. I don't think that, I don't think Holocaust survivors ever really, I mean, people who really were in the camps and so on, ever felt whole again after this experience. There's no, the creation of the monster is external. I mean, there's always talk about the shame, about the guilt, about this as Primo Levi says, it's like the moment that I didn't give the piece of bread to somebody who needed more than me. So I think there's the gray zone, the complicity, the Quisling effect is always within this moment of testifying. So I think this, especially for Holocaust, and I think also from my experience from doing interviews, the sense of good and bad, of good guys, bad guys, like in a cowboy movie, doesn't exist in this kind of testimonies. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have 10 more minutes, so I invite you to ask questions on block and
we can go overtime.
Yeah, I don't like overtime. Please.
And just a quick question about poetry as testimony. I was thinking about the fact that nowadays not many people actually read poetry. So I can admit that poetry is a kind of testimony, but I also think that the value of testimony is its capacity to be understood and to reach, a significant number of people. Is that the case of poetry?
May I respond to that, just briefly, or is there?
Okay, please do. Yeah.
No,
if you're impatient, do it.
No.
Come on.
I just didn't know whether there's a. Oh, because you mentioned en bloc. I'm so sorry.
Okay. Please.
I guess I have a quick question, and I think Professor von Halsberg got me thinking about it. Should we see in Celan, there's I guess an idea in visual art of negative space, where sometimes the more powerful message comes from what is not there. Should we see in Celan, through his austerity, is that capturing the staggering moment and weight of what he cannot speak about? Throughout this, I've been thinking of Wittgenstein, that which we cannot speak of, we must pass over in silence. And I'm wondering from the Celan scholars, is there something that we can read into the extreme pared down way that he speaks of the Holocaust as conveying the immensity of it? And is there something to that? Thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, any other questions before I let our speakers reply? First time, second time, third time, please.
I wanted just to ask, you just discussed about the idea that the poetry it's impossible after Auschwitz, but I was thinking about Primo Levi, and in the case of if this is a man, it's a question uomo. The poetry became not only possible but mandatory, because at the beginning of the poem, Primo Levi start at the beginning of the book. If this is a man, Primo Levi starts with a poem, exactly with a poem, and you must remember this poem because there is a curse on you if you don't remember this poem. So the poem, it's the strongest message, and the way to remember that something happened and that something can be in the future again.
Thank you.
Can I just quickly respond to that? Are we having more?
Please.
No, I just think that's a really good point that could have been made before as well. That the way that Levi introduces "If This Is a Man" with the poem Shema, how that actually that poem sets up our understanding of the testimony to follow. It's a really, really important point. And the other person who's really interesting to read in that regard is Charlotte Delbo. I don't know if you know her work, in which she places a kind of poetic and prose versions of events alongside one another. And again, I think that shows how the ways in which prose and poetry can both offer testimony, giving us different insights into experiences. If I can also just say something very quickly about the first comment, which I think is really important as well, about the readership for poetry. When Sue was talking about the different things that poetry does, the formal characteristics it has that allow it to do things that prose doesn't do, it put me in mind of the fact that, yes, you're completely right, Sue, when the Sonderkommando testified, they testified often through poetry, not prose. Anthony Rowland, in his book, Poetry as Testimony, starts off talking about the first World War I poets. In the UK, the main people we know, the main form of testimony we know is poetic, but you immediately maybe think, well, is that because it's something inherently to do with poetry, or is it to do with the fact that at the time poetry had a much wider readership, and that was in some way their way of thinking, this will allow me to speak about my experiences to a wide range of people because people read poetry, and these days it might be quite different. I don't know, but it's a very good point.
I would add to this a couple of things. One, I think it's cultural specific. So I'm not sure how many people read poetry in these parts. I mean, England, I know, as a publisher, I simply know that the readership of any kind of work in England has been waning over the years because books are sold less and less. And poetry, I think, is part of this trend. In the US, in my view, it's the exact opposite. Poetry is being read loud and clearly all over the place. You have poetry in motion on New York subways. There are, hundreds of independent presses publishing poetry. There are poetry slams. So the US is replete with poetry. And we don't have to judge it good or bad, but there's plenty of poetry, and it lends itself to being read for many, many reasons. Sometimes technological, sometimes simply because it articulates something in a nutshell that prose would have to take more time to do. There are other parts of the world, in the Muslim world, where people actually do write so-called land days, and there's a whole book that came out recently from FSG where they do 140 character, well, they call it landais. I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's not a haiku, but it's something that fits the technology. So poetry is actually on the rise globally, and that in itself speaks to its power, whatever that power may be. But more importantly, I've been trying to square why could Celan be important for this conference. So yes, he is one of the primary sources for us to go to as to how testimony played out in poetry after the Second World War, because he had historical primacy over many others. He published before Elie Wiesel's Night. He published before all of these other works came out. Todesfuge had already been published, 1945, I believe, right? Bertrand, correct me if I'm wrong. But more importantly, I think one has to look at the context. And in a sense, I've been asking myself over the past 3 days, so are we kind of the exotic element here, whereas there's this kind of chthonic element that really knows what's going on, and we are the onlookers who learn and get information, but don't really understand? Or is there something that the people who come from these regions can actually learn from what we have to bring to the table? And let's be very arrogant and let's say, yes, you can. Okay, and what could that be? Certainly not what I'm saying now or what we're saying. But I think Celan indeed might have something to teach us as a community and as different communities. And that's his role in Germany in particular. So whether we believe in his testimonial power or not is one thing. But the fact that he has been elevated, and again, Bertrand, you might know that much better than I, at this point in the German Academy, but there was a period when Celan was the holy grail of poetic interpretation. And it began, with Martin Broda's book, hit the German scene, and then there was the DFG, the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, would expend a lot of money to get these commented on, commentaries on his work. Lots of scholars from big universities would collaborate on them. Careers would be made and broken depending on how you read Celan or didn't. I knew many of those people, and I still know them in part, while Germany itself has a massive problem of dealing with its past to this day. So Celan himself did become a kind of Chiffre, a kind of crypt in Derridian terms and psychoanalytic terms, where you could in a way go to town on talking about the Shoah, the Holocaust, without actually, while risking your career potentially, but while remaining in the safe space of interpretation. And so that might be a kind of trap that might be all too easy to step into and fall into. And that's maybe something that ex negativo could be a lesson as to what not to do in the former Yugoslav regions. So not use poetry as a heyday for hermeneutes, but as something else. And it should also be, we should be aware of the fact that the general populace in Germany, and I'm just being very, very generalizing, does not read Celan. Todesfuge, maybe, but just go, poll people. Anything more complex? And if you ask even academics, they will cite the beautiful poetry, like Ich steige hinab zum Geschlecht der Geliebten. Those poems from his early volumes. And from the Niemandsrose, maybe Wohin ging's, gen unverklungen. Poems that are quotable, that are musical, melodic. The real meat is not part of the German canon. It's not like der Erlkönig, it's not like der Panther, it's not like Das Brot der frühen Jahre. It's not like many, many other texts that people do know and do refer to. So I think this is maybe a lesson he could teach everyone as to, how not to deal with poetry as testimony and how maybe to deal with it.
Thank you. I urge you just brief last points, please.
I'll try, yeah. About readership and I'm struggling to connect an interior dialogue with the other voices here. And this may sound ridiculous, but I would like to make amends once again about about the word Mensch and Celan's judgment that there are very few human beings, very few Mensch. But actually, I think if there are few Mensch, few human beings, this is his poems are trying to reach the human who could be anyone. The Mensch who could be anyone. It is the bottle mail, the message in the bottle. And this is also for instance, in the case of Martin Heidegger and Paul Celan's encounter with Heidegger, in very concrete terms in Tod Nauberg, Heidegger's famous cottage, die Hütte. So it may be so that his messages in a bottle only reach the selected few, but that's not what he doesn't really select. He doesn't really judge that. Okay, there are very few people, very few human beings, and they will, etc., etc. They are my public, but I think they are. If it's a bottle mail, if it's a message in a bottle, it can arrive at heartland anywhere and at anyone.
Okay. Thank you. Professor?
So I want to go back to, I want to develop what's just been said, but go back to the question about engagement, because the question about engagement is commonly understood as engagement in political action. And the engagement of a poet is properly in the medium of the art, namely in language. And it's for that reason, I think, that it's plausible to expect the bottle to come up, to wash up. That is to say, when a poet turns to language and analyzes language, finds patterns within words, recombines words and so forth, it's not like what a painter does, because the medium belongs to everybody. That is what a poet does is examine what is on your tongue, what's in your head, what will be in your head, and so forth. And that's an amazing thing about poetry, that it has access to structures of thought and expression that reach many people. The number of books that are published and so forth matters, but it's not there's this engagement with the medium that is important to call attention to, because often we speak about poetry as if it was engagement with the emotions, and that's its universality. We all feel this or we all feel that, and poetry tells us about our feelings. But that's, I think with Celan, it's very clear that he is interested in the medium itself and what can be done and what can be found in the medium. And when I'm teaching my students, I think that what I am doing is teaching students to live more deeply in the language. We all live in the language, and some of us live more deeply in language than others do. And that's something, as a teacher, you can exemplify. You can show students how poets have enriched the thought beyond what students think the sentence is saying. By looking at the etymology, you can see that more is being said, and isn't that a marvel? And that, I think, can affect people kind of deeply. And I think that sort of language project is something that's worth considering. The other thing I would say is that we underestimate the audience for poetry when we think that we can count up the books that are published, because we're listening to songs all the time. The songs are poems. The fact that they have musical accompaniment is fine, but they are poems. Now, some of them are lame poems, but many of them are not. Cole Porter is a poet, and many of his contemporaries were pretty good poets. Mm-hmm. And those songs, where are the songs that were written in English for the Broadway theater in the 20s, the 30s, and the 40s? Where are they? They are in the minds of millions of people. because they've been done over and over again by other, by later vocalists and so forth, and we have them by heart. Doesn't show up in book sales, but it's there. So we have a poetic life that is nothing to be ashamed of. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Just very, very quickly, to follow up on what Robert was saying, that the former U.S. poet laureate Robert Pinsky wrote a book called The Sounds of Poetry, in which he emphasizes that poetry is first and foremost a speech act, and that it's meant to be recited, and it's meant, Celan echoes this a little bit as well in some of his writings, as a speech act. And I think that ties in again to what you were saying about songs and the musicality, but also the act of engagement and testimony, that by virtue of being an act of speech, it is an engagement in the medium itself. It is a public expression of one's own feelings, thoughts, etc., that is put into the public sphere in search of an addressable you, as Celan said, in search of an audience, or perhaps in search of dialogue. So I think that there's something inherently testimonial about poetry as a genre by virtue of the fact that it's a speech act, first and foremost, at least according to Robert Pinsky.
I agree.
Thank you. If you would like?
Je voudrais dire que l'engagement de Celan, c'est d'abord de mettre en place une poésie critique.
I've already mentioned that Celan's engagement was to create a critical poetry.
Qui déconstruit tous les mythes et les mythologies.
It deconstructs all the myths and mythology.
Et il déconstruit surtout la fascination de la mort.
The ease with which death happened, death was created.
Il remplace la fascination de la mort par la confrontation avec toutes les formes de la mort.
He wants to replace the fascination with death with a confrontation with death.
Je dirais la poésie de Celan est le contraire de ce qu'on voit à Kalemegdan, les dinosaures et les canons.
Celan's poetry is the opposite of what we see at Kalemegdan.
Dinosaures.
The dinosaurs
et les canons.
And the cannons, excuse me.
I've been indoctrinated in the UK by a phrase, be merciful to your audience, which means, trying to stick to time to some extent. I would like to express my gratitude to all speakers for this, I would say, inherently poetic discussion about Celan's poetry, and more so about poetry in general, and for asking big questions like, can we become better people by reading poetry of testimony, and especially for bringing up this phrase, writing for an invisible tribunal. One tribunal is recently over here, but maybe I will sound too Levinas, like Levinas, or maybe too Protestant if I say that this tribunal is over, but there is this invisible tribunal of all those victims that we should still have in mind. And with these words, I thank you all and I release you.